The lamp was glowing, yet the room stayed dark. Welcome to Mind Night Detective. I am your host, Elderwick. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Your voices make these mysteries unforgettable. Let's begin. It was the kind of morning Oxford reserves for the weary and the uncertain. A colourless sky stretched thin above the college spires, the stone facades washed of their dignity by a drizzle that refused to quicken or relent. I remember pausing outside the lodge at St. Fridswide's, half wishing for a cigarette, though I had given them up years before. The porter had rung me earlier, his voice low, almost apologetic, as though he himself were to blame for what had been found. Inside, the cloisters smelled of wet wool and old paper, a mingling that seemed oddly appropriate. I was shown to a narrow staircase where the plaster peeled in secret curls. At the landing, a door stood open, not forced, not even properly closed. It was there that we found the girl. A scholarship student, I was told, diligent in her essays, fond of the library's upper galleries. She had died, quietly it seemed, at her desk, head bowed as if still attending to her notes, though the ink beneath her hand had long since dried. The doctor murmured about the heart, about congenital frailties that reveal themselves only in silence. Perhaps he was right. Yet something in the arrangement unsettled me. Her glass of water, untouched, the pages around her, too neat for a student at midnight. The small radio on the sill dialed to a station that had not broadcast since the 60s. Small absurdities, but enough to snag in the mind like burrs. Lewis, ever steady, asked whether I thought it was suicide. I told him no, not in that tone, not with the clock on the mantel still wound and ticking. People who intend to depart seldom mind the furniture of time. He frowned at me, as he always did when my answers drifted toward the oblique. I leafed through the papers on her desk. A half-finished crossword lay among them. One clue remained unsolved, 11 across. The definition was given as grave misgiving, 5 letters. She had written the first 3, Q-U-A. Quail, of course, though she had left it blank. Fear unnamed, though waiting in plain sight. I folded the page back as the doctor drew the sheet over her shoulders. Outside, the quad shone with a faint, reluctant light. A pair of undergraduates hurried past, whispering with the thrill of proximity to tragedy. I envied them their innocence, their capacity to treat death as a kind of theatre. For me, the play had been running too long. We spoke with the warden in his study, a room perfumed with leather and the faint, medicinal odor of brandy. He regretted the loss, naturally. She was promising, he said. They were all promising, until they weren't. He asked me whether the police must be involved at all. It was, after all, an unfortunate but natural occurrence. I told him that was not yet certain. He sighed, as if my persistence were a kind of discourtesy. Later, in the library where she had often worked, I found myself staring at the windows mottled with rain. Books leaned on one another like weary companions. A young man replaced volumes on a high shelf with meticulous care, his fingers lingering too long on the bindings. When he turned, I caught the nervous flicker in his eyes, the slight compression of lips that suggested secrets not yet volunteered. He greeted me politely, then vanished into the stacks. These are the moments one recalls in retrospect, when the pattern finally emerges. At the time, they were only fragments, impressions too delicate to voice aloud. Yet they stayed with me, like a tune heard through a wall, unfinished but insistent. That evening, walking alone past the Sheldonian, I considered the unsolved clue again. Grave misgiving. Quail. The girl had reached the threshold of the answer, but not the answer itself. Or perhaps she had, and had chosen to leave it incomplete. Either way, I felt the word settle within me, heavy as the mist that clung to the cobbles. Oxford, that pale morning, had offered me no certainties. only a beginning. It was Lewis who returned with the keys that afternoon, though the porter seemed reluctant to part with them. The great wooden ring clattered against his desk as though marking a register of trespass. Keys always have their hierarchies in Oxford. The right to open, the right to exclude. When they were handed to us, the air of resistance lingered, like the dust in the rafters. The college was not large, not poor, yet not of those names that draw postcards and Japanese tourists. It breathed instead a kind of half-light, a hush born not from sanctity but from neglect. Corridors ran longer than they seemed necessary, their ceilings bowed from centuries of damp. Each step echoed as though amplified by the emptiness itself. Lewis remarked that it was a gloomy place, and I thought how easily gloom is confused with secrecy. I told him so, and he smiled in that way of his that allowed me my melancholy without agreement. We walked first through the chapel. The air smelt faintly of wax and lilies left too long in their vases. Candles had burnt themselves down to finger lengths. A lectern in the form of a brass eagle gleamed with a care inconsistent with the rest. Someone still polished it, I noted, with dutiful fervor. The choir stalls, however, bore dust where no voice had risen in days. The girl. Her name was Caroline, though I found myself reluctant to use it too soon. Had sung here, the chaplain told us. A clear soprano, he said, but shy in manner. I wondered whether shyness and clarity often walked together. He looked at me with suspicion, as if my silence itself were accusatory. Lewis asked the usual questions. When had she last attended service? Who had been close to her? Whether she seemed troubled? Answers came wrapped in the cotton wool of vagueness. She was diligent. She was quiet. She was perhaps lonely. None of it amounted to substance. From the chapel, we moved to the library. The door groaned as though reluctant to allow us entry. Inside, the smell of leather was thick, almost cloying. The long central table was littered with notes abandoned by generations of students, their ink faded to a kind of collective anonymity. I touched one at random, a fragment of Latin verse, unfinished, like a thought dropped in haste. Lewis busied himself with the official register. I, instead, stood at the high windows, watching the rain stitch faint patterns across the quadrangle. I recalled the young man I'd seen earlier, shelving books with undue care. I asked the librarian about him. She frowned, adjusted her spectacles. A junior fellow, she said. Research in medieval philosophy. She spoke his name reluctantly, as though naming gave him a weight she disapproved of. There was something in her tone that pulled me aside, though I could not yet place it. Not dislike, not fear. Rather the kind of disquiet one reserves for those who appear too perfect, too faultlessly mannered. On a desk near the window, I noticed a slip of paper pinned beneath a small stone. A timetable of lectures, days crossed through with quick strokes, the final date still bare. I recognized Caroline's handwriting from the crossword. Her last intended lecture had been on Spinoza, that most rational of philosophers, and yet, at the bottom margin, she had doodled a set of interlocking circles, a childish pattern of infinity. Contradiction is often the only honest expression. In the dining hall, the tables were laid, though no meal was imminent. Silver gleamed in anticipation, candles unlit. The portraits above stared down with varying degrees of disdain. It struck me how the college maintained its rituals with devotion, though its young bled silently into grief. Lewis asked whether I felt we were any closer to knowing. I told him that knowledge often hides in its opposite. He muttered something about riddles, but I heard no irritation, only resignation. As we prepared to leave, I noticed again the keys, heavy in Lewis's hand. One among them was brighter than the rest, its edges sharper, its use recent. Yet the door it fitted. Which door was that? I made no remark, though the thought settled like a pebble at the bottom of a pool. Evening drew across the college like a hood. Shadows stretched in corridors until they seemed to breathe. The porter locked the gate behind us, his eyes following our departure. I felt, as I so often did in Oxford, that the buildings themselves conspired in silence, guarding their secrets not from malice but from habit. And so the day closed, with rain still falling, with unanswered questions multiplying like echoes in stone, and with the faint conviction that the girl's death was less an end than a beginning written in code I had not yet deciphered. It was a day for umbrellas and gossip. The rain sheared to needles, and the pavements glossed like pewter. Lewis wanted a list, neat as a menu. I told him we would begin with the obvious and end with the awkward, that suspects in Oxford divided themselves into gown and town, but often wore the other's coat when it suited them. He said that sounded like trouble. It sounded like the city on any afternoon. We called first on the warden. His fire was newly laid but not lit, an affectation of thrift undone by the decanter within reach. He spoke of Caroline with administrative gratitude. She raised standards, he said, though the college had always maintained them. I asked who resented her. He preferred envied. A small distinction, I said, but men have killed for less. His eyes cooled, and he remembered a meeting. The librarian came next, lavender clinging faintly about her scarf. Caroline was a creature of habit, she said, though not of people. She kept to the north window in the afternoons, the seat nearest the catalogue. I asked whether anyone challenged that sovereignty. The junior fellow, perhaps. He disliked territory not conceded by authority. Meticulous, she added, as though tidiness excused obsession. I stored the word away like a penciled clue. We found him among the medievals, where dust drifted like incense. He greeted us with a smile that thought itself harmless. He had tutored Caroline once, only once, not enough to claim influence. He admired her clarity, regretted her lack of ambition. Ambition is a loud word, I said, and ill-suited to libraries. He told me she had skipped their last supervision. He had mentioned this to the chaplain. Why a theologian? Confessions take the shapes available, he replied. As he replaced a book, I saw his hands align it not with the shelf, but with the shadow of the shelf, a correction more precise than required. Pedantry is a mask, but masks slip. The chaplain's room smelt of dust and tea. He had a photograph of Caroline at evensong, her mouth shaped around a note the camera could not hold. He remembered her as good. I asked whether goodness meant obedience or effort. Both, he said. She had come once, asking about forgiveness, not the doctrine but the mechanics. What must be returned when forgiveness is granted? He had told her that sometimes nothing could be returned not intact. He did not ask why she wanted to know. I did, and he looked down at his dented biscuit tin. That evening we crossed from Gown to town, to the pub off the market where the barmaid moved like a nurse through a ward. She remembered Caroline's single whiskey, taken with the caution of a beginner dancing with her own shadow. Once or twice she was joined by a man with a scholar's complexion and a tradesman's hands. He never stayed long. He tipped in coins, not notes, counting as if buying contrition. The landlord laughed through smoke. The man always asked about the last bus and never rode it. Lewis asked who would watch a man like that. Everyone, I said, and no one. On the walk back, the rain slackened into mist. I looked again at Caroline's crossword folded in my pocket. One clue I had missed. 4 down. Keeper of accounts. 6 letters. Ledger was plain enough, yet she had written reader and then crossed it out. A slip, perhaps, but one that pressed on me with the weight of intention. Accounts in Oxford are rarely financial alone. The reader keeps a ledger of a subtler kind. I thought of the librarian's tightened scarf, the warden's cooled eyes, the fellow's shadow-aligned book. I thought of a man paying with coins as if receipts were dangerous. We returned the keys to the porter. He asked whether the police were satisfied. I told him satisfaction belonged in prospectuses. In the gloom of the lodge, a notice board bore its jumble of events, earnest with posterity. One slip had been pinned twice over, as though someone feared its escape. A charity concert. Tonight, chapel. Admission free. Caroline's name still stood on the program, uncorrected by death. I felt the old ache of bureaucratic fidelity. Or perhaps it was an invitation. The city held its breath like a hymn not yet permitted to begin. The porter telephoned again that morning, his voice caught between duty and superstition. Something had been found, he said, in the grate of Caroline's rooms. Half burned, though not consumed. Such relics have a way of surviving as though fire itself respects ambiguity. I went alone. Lewis was busy with statements, the endless lists and initials that make up the scaffolding of police work. I preferred the silence of the room, curtains drawn against a daylight that struggled even when unopposed. The air carried the faint scent of ash, mixed with that dry sweetness of books that have absorbed decades of dust. The note lay where the porter had placed it, on a saucer once meant for tea. The edges curled inward like petals retreating from frost. Words had survived in uneven stretches, ink smudged but legible enough to wound. Not betrayal, but debt. Not friend, but reader. Then the line faltered into char, as if secrecy had at last remembered its obligations. I touched the paper lightly, knowing it would crumble at insistence. Whoever had lit the match had allowed conscience, or cowardice, to intervene before the flame could finish its feast. That pause was its own message. A guilty man seeks obliteration. An uncertain one leaves a trail. I thought again of the librarian's taut voice, of the junior fellow's precision, of the warden's reluctance. Each had spoken with words measured, yet none had convinced me they welcomed the light of inspection. Debt, the note had said. Not money, surely. Oxford debts are less tangible, paid in silence, in loyalty withheld, in reputations bartered across common rooms. I searched the small desk again. The drawers were orderly, almost too orderly, the kind of tidiness imposed by another hand. Among the exercise books I found a fragment of music manuscript, just a bar of melody, unfinished, notes, climbing before halting in indecision. Caroline had sung, yes, but why compose? Or had it been someone else's hand left for her to decipher? Outside, rain pressed against the glass in thin diagonal strokes. The quad lay blurred, a watercolor without conviction. A student crossed quickly, coat drawn close, and vanished beneath the arch. Life persists around death, unchastened. Lewis arrived later, shaking rain from his hair. He asked whether the note said anything useful. I told him that usefulness was a policeman's word. Truth was not often useful. He grunted, though without hostility. He read the fragments aloud, stumbling slightly over reader. He said it could mean anything. That is precisely why it means something, I replied. He asked whether Caroline had written it herself. The hand was hers, though the phrasing felt foreign. A girl careful with crosswords would not allow such looseness. I suspected dictation or a message written under watch. Lewis said I was imagining patterns. I reminded him that imagination is sometimes all that remains when fact withholds its kindness. We stood by the grate, its soot still faintly warm. I noticed the matches on the mantel, arranged in a box too full. One match was shorter, replaced after use. Not a student's economy, but a collector's neatness. Someone had struck, halted, and tidied the evidence back into line. That was the gesture that betrayed them, though I said nothing yet. As we left, the corridor smelled of damp coats and lamp oil. The stairwell groaned with each step, a reminder that buildings observe even when men forget. I folded the note into my pocket, careful not to disturb its fragile edges. A message half destroyed still speaks, though it whispers. That night I unfolded it again beneath my lamp, the letters shadowed against the table. Debt. Reader. Silence between them like a pause in music. I thought of the program pinned twice to the board, Caroline's name still offered as though she might yet sing. A half-burnt note, a half-finished bar, a half-completed clue. Oxford was teaching me again that incompletion is itself a kind of answer. I poured a measure of whiskey and let the rain at my window argue with itself. Some cases are written in ash, and one learns to read what the fire has chosen to spare. The college secretary had agreed to see us, though agreement in Oxford is often a ceremony of reluctance. Her office lay at the end of a passage that smelled of polish and fatigue, the kind of corridor where clocks tick louder than hearts. She was a woman of middle years, severe in attire, yet her eyes betrayed an untidiness of thought. Papers spread across her desk in nervous formations, as if every sheet feared abandonment. Lewis asked first about Caroline's records, bursary statements, correspondence, permissions. The secretary produced them with a speed that suggested rehearsal. She had been a good student, punctual with forms, modest with requests. I asked whether modesty was always a virtue. The secretary looked at me as though I had questioned gravity. Then she hesitated, tapping her pencil against the cover of a ledger. She had once asked for something unusual, she admitted at last. Not money, not privilege. She had asked to see minutes from a committee meeting. Why? Caroline said she wished to correct an error. The secretary had declined. Minutes are not for students. The pencil continued its tapping. I asked whether she had kept a diary, a personal one, not institutional. She froze, and in that stillness I heard the confession. There was such a book, yes, though it was only for recollection, not for intrigue. She opened a drawer and placed it gently before me, leather worn, edges bruised with use. I glanced at Lewis, who frowned. "We are not in the habit of reading women's secrets," he muttered. I told him secrets rarely belong to those who write them. The diary smelled faintly of lavender and ink. I turned to the week of Caroline's death. Entries neat, almost obsessive. Tuesday, student at window late, copying furiously. Wednesday, whispered conversation with fellow near library staircase. Thursday, Caroline asked again about minutes. Friday, a note left on desk, unsigned, folded twice. The secretary had written, "Did not open, burnt in grate." I looked up. She shifted under my gaze. I asked whether she often burned correspondence. "Never," she said. "Only that one." Why? She could not explain except that it frightened her. Lewis pressed for description. "Plain paper," she said, but the fold was too careful. She placed it in the fire without reading, and yet, she admitted, she had felt as though the paper resisted. The flames had struggled. I recalled the half-burned note from Caroline's room. 2 fires, 2 survivals. Oxford does not permit destruction. It prefers palimpsest. Turning another page, I found a crossword clue scribbled in the margin, unconnected to the day's entry. 6 letters, definition given as concealed truth. She had written secret, then crossed it out, replacing it with casket. Both were correct in their way, though neither satisfied her. It struck me that her mind, like mine, sought answers by circuitous means. I asked whether she had solved it. She shook her head. I told her sometimes an unsolved clue tells us more than the answer. Lewis grew impatient. He asked whether she suspected anyone. She closed the diary and rested her hand upon it as one does on a Bible. "Everyone," she said, "and no one." In colleges, she explained, intimacy and anonymity coexist. You know faces, not souls. You overhear, you rarely understand. We left her there, her hand still resting on the closed book. Outside, the quad glistened with rain, and the chapel bell rehearsed its dull monotone. I walked slowly, replaying her words. Minutes, errors, folded notes, fire that resisted. The secretary had seen more than she admitted, and her diary had spoken more than she intended. At the gate, I asked Lewis whether he remembered the clue she had crossed out. Concealed truth, 6 letters. He muttered, secret. I told him she had written casket. He said that made no sense. Perhaps not, I said, though truth is often buried as carefully as any corpse. He shook his head, muttering that I was speaking riddles again. Perhaps I was. That evening, in my rooms, I poured a whiskey and unfolded Caroline's crossword beside the secretary's copied entry. 2 women writing clues, both unable to complete them. The symmetry was too neat to dismiss. I wondered whether Oxford itself was playing the setter, and we merely the solvers, condemned always to chase patterns, half concealed, half burned, never whole. The High Street carries its secrets less discreetly than the colleges, though with no less conviction. Among the bookshops and tobacconists, the cafes that pretend to tradition, one feels always watched, not by eyes, but by the centuries themselves. It was there Lewis and I wandered that afternoon, following whispers that Caroline had been seen beyond her accustomed cloisters. The rain had thinned, leaving pavements slick and the air sharp with the mingled scents of coffee and coal smoke. Lewis remarked that students rarely ventured this far for anything more serious than a pint. Yet I had heard otherwise. A girl with dark hair, carrying music sheets beneath her arm, had been noticed in a little antiquarian shop just east of the covered market. We entered. The bell above the door jangled its minor chord. Shelves leaned with exhaustion, their volumes arranged more by whim than order. Behind the counter, a man with nicotine-stained fingers welcomed us with the bland courtesy of one long accustomed to inquiries he would rather ignore. Caroline. Yes, he remembered her. She had looked at hymnals, requested a score of plainchant, asked whether any medieval codices ever came his way. He had smiled, indulging her, but she had spoken with a precision that unsettled him. Not a casual shopper, then, but someone with a purpose. Lewis asked what purpose. The bookseller shrugged. She had spoken of voices that did not belong to the present, that perhaps belonged nowhere. He laughed when he told us this, but the laugh carried unease. I noticed a thin ledger on his counter, its pages crowded with names and sums. I asked if her name appeared there. He shook his head too quickly, closing the book with finality. We left with more uncertainty than we had entered. Red herrings, I thought, swim best in such waters. A girl asking for forgotten music, a man denying sales, a ledger closed with unnecessary haste. Each detail plausible, yet none offering sustenance. Later, in a narrow tea room where the windows steamed against the street, we spoke to a waitress who remembered Caroline sitting alone. She had ordered nothing more than hot water and a slice of lemon. A student with no money, Lewis said. Perhaps, I replied, though hot water asks no sugar, leaves no stain. A drink chosen for invisibility. The waitress recalled a man joining her once. Older, respectable coat, yet his voice low, urgent. They had not stayed long. She thought he pressed something into Caroline's hand. A folded sheet, perhaps a note. Lewis scribbled, asked about description. She shook her head. All older men in Oxford wear the same coat. Back on the High, the crowds pressed with indifference. I felt suddenly the futility of faces. Everyone resembled someone else, and innocence wore the same expression as guilt. We entered a pub at Lewis's suggestion. A dim room where the talk was loud, though the silences louder still. The landlord, wiping glasses, said Caroline had come once, alone, ordered half a bitter and left it unfinished. She seemed waiting for someone. Who, he could not say. He recalled only that she had written on a napkin, folded it, and then, this he remembered clearly, tore it into 4 exact quarters before leaving. Lewis sighed. Another dead trail. Perhaps. Yet the symmetry of that tearing caught me. Most people shred unevenly in haste. To fold and quarter is an act of deliberation, almost ritual. I remembered the secretary's diary entry, the folded note she burned, folded twice. Caroline's napkin, folded twice, then once more, then destroyed. A pattern was whispering, though its language was not yet mine. We returned along the high street, its lamps lighting puddles like scattered coins. Lewis muttered that we were chasing phantoms. He was not wrong, but Oxford thrives on phantoms. It would wither without them. A half-finished drink, a denied ledger, a napkin quartered. Clues, perhaps, or merely shadows. Still, I carried them with me, as one carries fragments of a crossword not yet solved, trusting that in time the scattered letters will conspire toward sense. The chapel was already darkening when I returned, the lamps lit early against a sky of unconvincing blue. The air carried its usual perfume of wax and damp stone, though this evening it seemed thicker, as if infused with unease. The chaplain had agreed, reluctantly, to speak with us again. Reluctance, I had found, was his native idiom. He sat at the far end of the choir stalls, his cassock folded like mourning cloth. Lewis went first, asking when he had last seen Caroline. He said the previous Sunday, after evensong. She had stayed behind as the others departed, waiting until the candles guttered. He had asked whether something troubled her. She had replied with a single question, "Is forgiveness the same as forgetting?" Lewis frowned at this, but I asked what he had answered. He said he had told her forgiveness does not erase memory, it merely alters its weight. She had shaken her head, almost impatiently, as though his theology were inadequate to her need. I looked up at the pulpit, still draped with green for the season. Once, perhaps twice, I had attended sermons here, though I had found the chaplain's voice more soporific than inspired. Yet that evening I sensed Thar architecture itself echoing words not spoken. Every arch in Oxford preserves sermons long vanished, sermons addressed less to faith than to guilt. Lewis asked whether she had confessed anything more. "No," the chaplain said, but she had left a slip of paper on the lectern. He had thrown it away, assuming it no more than a note to herself. I asked whether he recalled the words. He hesitated, then admitted he did. It read, "The truth is in the ledger, not in the minutes." Lewis muttered that this meant nothing. I said it meant that someone's official record was a fabrication. Minutes are approved lies, ledgers are reluctant truths. The chaplain seemed startled, though whether by the interpretation or by the memory itself I could not tell. We walked with him through the sacristy, the wooden cupboards sighing with the weight of centuries. On a small shelf I noticed a pile of hymnals, one out of place, its spine cracked, its edges faintly charred. I asked about it. He claimed not to have noticed, yet the coincidence was too sharp. Another book kissed by fire, another remnant refusing destruction. I opened it to the middle and found a single penciled line. Psalm 130, verse 3. "If thou, Lord, shouldest mark iniquities, O Lord, who shall stand?" Lewis scoffed at the melodrama, but I traced the pencil's pressure, hurried, uneven, unlike the careful hand I had seen in Caroline's crossword. Someone else, then. Someone who wished to speak through her texts, perhaps to her, perhaps to us. As we left, the chaplain paused at the door. He said quietly that Caroline had sung at the last concert with unusual fervor. She had chosen Purcell's "Hear My Prayer, O Lord." He had thought little of it at the time. Now it seemed like foreknowledge. His eyes dropped to the floor as though he feared I might accuse him of prophecy. Outside, twilight bled across the quad. The rain had paused but left the flagstones slick, their reflections doubling the arches in spectral symmetry. Lewis asked whether I believed the chaplain. I told him belief was a poor companion to inquiry. Still, I had heard something in the man's tone, a note not of deceit, but of omission. He carried too many sermons within him, and some were not preached aloud. On the way back, I recalled Caroline's crossword again. One clue unsolved, another miswritten. Quail, ledger, secret. And now a psalm, half charred in a hymnal. The city seemed to speak in fragments, each one unfinished, awaiting connection. That night, with whiskey dulling the edges of the day, I looked again at the penciled verse. If thou, Lord, shouldest mark iniquities. The psalm itself posed the question of records, of ledgers kept by heaven. Perhaps Caroline's death was not an end, but an accounting. Perhaps the sermon we were hearing now was written not in doctrine, but in ash, in crosswords, in ledgers closed too quickly. And perhaps, I thought, no sermon in Oxford ever truly ends. It only echoes faintly in the minds of those who still listen. She waited for us in the senior common room, a place where curtains hung too heavily for the size of the windows, and the air tasted faintly of sherry left open to breathe. Her name was Mrs. Markham, college bursar, though the dons called her secretary in public and tyrant in private. A woman of wit, they said, though wit sharpened often cuts without sound. She greeted me with a smile that looked rehearsed on polished glass. Lewis, who is not easily disarmed, shifted under her gaze. She asked whether the police still pursued shadows in libraries, or had we graduated to the business of facts. I replied that facts were usually shadows themselves, elongated by the light of circumstance. She lifted her glass in mock salute. We spoke of Caroline. Mrs. Markham remembered her as clever but naive, a combination Oxford both cultivates and punishes. She said the girl had once petitioned for correction of a financial discrepancy. Not her own account, another's. I asked whose. She claimed not to recall. It had been trivial, she said, a decimal misplaced. But her eyes flickered briefly toward the fire, as though the truth smoldered there. Lewis asked about the college minutes. Mrs. Markham laughed, though without warmth. Minutes are tidy fiction, she said. We write them as we wish the world to be remembered. I asked who kept the ledgers. She sipped her sherry before answering. I do. And unlike the minutes, they are untidy truth. Her manner was composed, but her desk, glimpsed through the half-open door of her office, was less so. Files leaned uneasily, folders frayed. Yet one volume stood apart, bound in black, corners burnished by touch. I asked about it. She replied quickly, routine accounts, nothing more. Lewis scribbled, unimpressed. I let it rest, though the image remained fixed in my mind like a misaligned clue. As we rose to leave, she remarked that Caroline had been seen in the high street with a man older than herself. She could not, or would not, name him. But she said the girl looked less frightened than determined, as if bargaining with her own reflection. Lewis asked if she thought it was romantic. Romance is a child's word, she replied. Transactions are older and more reliable. Outside, rain had returned, tapping the stone like hesitant fingers. Lewis muttered that she was cold as marble. I thought otherwise. Coldness suggests absence of heat. In her case, the fire was hidden, banked, never extinguished. Wit is armor, I said. Ice preserves. That evening, back in my rooms, I unfolded Caroline's crossword once more. Another clue had troubled me. 7 down, definition given as exacting woman, 3 letters. She had written ICE, then erased it until the paper tore. Perhaps she had thought of Mrs. Markham. Perhaps she had known her armor better than we. I poured myself a measure and considered the fragments, the burned notes, the folded napkin, the ledger glimpsed in shadow, each piece incomplete, yet together, forming an outline not unlike the figure of the woman we had just met. Composed, amused, concealing. Caroline had reached for truth and found ice. Lewis telephoned later, reporting that Mrs. Markham had been seen leaving college unusually late on the night Caroline died. He asked whether I thought coincidence mattered in Oxford. I told him coincidence is the city's favorite disguise. Beneath it, motives breathe patiently. As the night deepened, I heard rain on the roof turn heavier, a slow percussion above the silence. I thought of Mrs. Markham's gaze, cold but intelligent, of Caroline's erased answer in the crossword, of the fire she had not concealed quickly enough when decimals betrayed themselves. Oxford breeds women of wit, yes, but wit sharpened on the ledgers of men leaves traces, even in ice. And so another piece had shifted into place. Not certainty, not even clarity, but the faint sound of a pattern forming, like a tune heard distantly through locked doors. The library at St. Fridwide's had a way of keeping its own counsel. Dust softened the silence, and the lamps hummed faintly with their fatigue. I returned there on an evening when the quad outside was inked with rain, the kind of night when one expects discoveries because the city seems unwilling to let them sleep. The librarian was absent, but the doors had been left unlocked, perhaps by oversight, perhaps by intention. I moved among the long desks, their surfaces scarred by decades of compasses and pens, until my eye caught a frame half hidden behind a stack of journals. A photograph, black and white, its glass cracked at the corner. It showed Caroline, though younger by a year or two, seated beside three others. One I recognized, the junior fellow in philosophy, his smile too rehearsed to be comfortable. Another was a woman with stern features, surely Mrs. Markham, though her hair had not yet surrendered to grey. The last was a man older still, his expression blurred as if he had turned away at the moment of exposure. The composition was uneasy, not accidental. Lewis arrived, shaking rain from his coat. He asked what I had found. I showed him the photograph. He studied it, unimpressed. A student event, he said. Some college dinner, perhaps. I told him dinners rarely produced such uneasy alignments. Photographs are clues not of presence, but of absence. Who chooses where to stand? Who leans forward? Who looks away? Caroline sat between them like a question no one dared to answer. We searched the back of the frame. There was an inscription in Caroline's hand. 4 words: minutes hide, ledgers reveal. The echo of the chaplain's recollection. The phrase had traveled through too many mouths not to be deliberate. Lewis sighed, muttering that every clue in this place repeated itself until it meant nothing. I disagreed. Repetition is not redundancy. It is insistence. We replaced the photograph where it had been, though I kept the inscription in my memory. As we left, the librarian appeared in the doorway, startled to find us. She asked whether we had taken anything. I said only dust. Her glance flicked towards the journals, then towards the photograph, too quickly suppressed. I asked her when it had been taken. She claimed not to know. Yet her hands, folded too tightly before her, betrayed a memory too fresh for indifference. Later, in my rooms, I unfolded Caroline's crossword again. One clue had until now escaped my attention. 10 across, definition given as captured image. 9 letters. She had written photograph, then erased it, writing instead confession. Wrong length, wrong answer, yet perhaps closer to her truth. A photograph, like a confession, reveals only what it chooses, conceals as much as it displays. I thought of the 4 faces. The girl, the philosopher, the bursar, the man half-turned. Who had kept that picture hidden among journals? Who had placed it there to be found? And by whom? Oxford arranges its mysteries like shelves, always leaving one volume slightly misaligned so the observant may stumble. Lewis telephoned before midnight. He had asked quietly among the porters. The photograph had been taken at a committee supper, not a student dinner. Caroline had been present not as guest but as assistant. She had been asked to copy notes, perhaps draft minutes. That explained her knowledge of errors, her insistence on correction. I said it explained more than that. It explained why she had seen too much and why she could not forget. Lewis asked who the blurred man might be. I told him sometimes the most important figure is the one who avoids the camera's eye. He accused me of seeing patterns in smudges, perhaps. Yet I knew that smudge was not absence but resistance. Some truths refused to be fixed in focus. I poured another whiskey, listening to the rain slacken on the glass. In Oxford, photographs are rarely innocent. They are documents as carefully arranged as any set of minutes and more dangerous for their pretense of truth. Caroline had written confession where the clue demanded photograph. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps in that cracked frame lay a confession, though in whose voice I could not yet decide. The rain had eased, leaving pavements slick with the gloss of retreat, and I found myself once more in Caroline's rooms. They had not yet been cleared, though the air already bore the smell of absence, that faint mingling of dust and resignation which follows quickly on death. Lewis was elsewhere, occupied with interviews, and I was glad of the solitude. On her desk lay the crossword again. I had folded it carefully each time, but the paper grew weaker with handling, as though the answers themselves wished to vanish. Tonight, though, it was not the grid that claimed my attention, but the notebook beside it, a cheap exercise book whose first pages were filled with lecture notes in her neat, unwavering hand. The later pages told a different story. Here the writing grew irregular, ink smudged by haste or by hesitation. Some entries were no more than fragments, phrases, initials, arrows linking one word to another. Reader, ledger, fire. Beneath one scrawl I saw a shape, not a word, but a series of interlocking circles, the same childish infinity she had doodled on her timetable. I traced the loops with my finger and thought of patterns repeating, questions that never resolve. On the final page the ink had bled where water must have touched it. Rain, perhaps, or tears. Yet one phrase remained legible. He makes her copy. Copy what? Minutes, accounts, words whispered in stairwells. The ambiguity itself was a kind of confession. I set the book down and returned to the crossword. One clue remained unfinished. 15 across. Definition given as instrument of record. 5 letters. She had written LED and left the final squares blank. Ledger, surely. Yet I noticed something else. She had written the letters not straight but slanted, as though her hand resisted completion. Was it hesitation or refusal? Perhaps she knew the answer and rejected it, or perhaps she wished to tell me the ledger itself was unfinished. The lamp on her desk flickered. I leaned back, staring at the small radio on the sill. The dial still rested on a frequency long extinct. Why keep it thus, unless it were symbolic? A station that no longer spoke, a silence preserved in numbers. Oxford lives by symbols more than facts. I have often thought so. Lewis arrived as the clock struck 10. He asked what kept me. I handed him the exercise book. He flipped through the pages without comment until he reached the phrase, "He makes her copy." He asked who I thought he was. I told him that if I knew, I would not be here. He muttered that it could mean anything, and perhaps it did. But in her choice of tense, makes, not made, I felt something chilling, present, ongoing, unescaped. She had written it not as memory, but as condition. He shook his head, weary. He asked whether the crossword meant anything more to me. I told him it meant everything, though I could not yet say why. He laughed softly, indulgently, and left me to my ghosts. When I was alone again, I studied the ink stains on the final page. They resembled islands on a map, continents imagined by sailors before discovery. One blot curved like a question mark, another like an eye. I wondered whether she had noticed this herself. I wondered whether she had smiled. The night deepened. I folded the book, folded the crossword, and placed them together in my coat pocket. Outside, the stairwell creaked beneath my weight, as if reluctant to release me. A puzzle in ink, yes. But ink is treacherous. It records and it conceals. It smudges. It fades. It survives in fragments that demand more from the living than they ever meant to give. Caroline had written enough to leave me restless, but never enough to leave me whole. The evening of the concert arrived with a drizzle that refused to become rain. The chapel lamps had been lit earlier than usual. Their glow filtered through diamond panes until the windows seemed bruised with amber. I entered quietly, though in Oxford one never truly arrives unseen. The very stones observe, each step echoing like an accusation. Students filed in with subdued chatter, gowns brushing damp ankles. Faculty followed, their faces rehearsed in composure. The program still bore Caroline's name, untouched by revision, as though paper might resist death better than flesh. I sat near the back, preferring distance, and watched the candles flare against the choir stalls. The chaplain opened with a prayer too familiar to carry meaning. Then the music began. Purcell first, voices rising with fragile unity, each note straining upward as if reluctant to leave the safety of the stave. I found myself listening not for melody, but for absence. Where Caroline's soprano might have carried, there remained only a hollow space, a silence more articulate than song. Lewis leaned toward me, whispering that we should not be here, that concerts do not solve murders. I replied that they sometimes confess them. He gave me the look he reserves for my indulgences and turned back to the music. Midway through, a soloist faltered on an entrance. A note missed, then corrected, but the hesitation lodged in my mind. My eyes shifted to the junior fellow in philosophy. Seated apart, his hands clasped too tightly. His gaze did not follow the music but remained fixed on the candles, as if he wished them extinguished. When applause came, his hands did not move. Afterward, the congregation dispersed into the cloisters. The air smelled of wax cooling, mingled with damp wool and stone. I lingered by the notice board, the same one where the concert had been pinned twice. A new slip had been added, minutes of a recent meeting, neat in typescript. Yet I saw at once the anomaly. One page misaligned, margins narrower, ink slightly darker. Inserted after the fact, though the eye of routine would pass it by. I asked Lewis whether he saw it. He shrugged, saying it was nothing but bad type. I told him bad type is often truer than neat lies. The chaplain approached, his face weary. He asked whether the concert had been of comfort. I said comfort was rarely my pursuit. He lowered his eyes, then mentioned Caroline once more. She had sung, he said, with unusual intensity at her last rehearsal, the lamp beside the organ already lit, though it was not yet dark. She had insisted on it, claiming she sang better with light near her. The lamp was lit, he repeated, as if the phrase carried weight he could not define. I walked to the organ loft. The lamp still stood, its base scarred with wax, its switch faintly warm from use. A small scrap of paper lay beneath it, forgotten in shadow. I lifted it carefully. A fragment of music notation, 3 bars only, yet unmistakably the same hand I had seen in Caroline's desk. Above the stave she had written a single word. Remember. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I did not yet know, but the bars themselves seemed incomplete, an unfinished cadence that demanded resolution. Much like the crossword clue she had left blank, much like the ledger half-suggested, much like the photograph blurred. Oxford itself seemed intent on endings withheld. We left the chapel as the last lamp was extinguished, save for that one by the organ, still burning faintly against the dark. I looked back once. The light seemed less a guide than a witness, refusing silence. That night I poured my whiskey more slowly than usual, thinking of her words scrawled above the stave. Remember, not confess, not forgive. Remember. Perhaps that was all she had asked of us, in music, in ink, in ash. And perhaps memory, like the lamp, burns long after the song itself has ended. It was late when we left the chapel, the rain having thickened into a steady veil. The lamps in the quad cast circles of weary gold, yet between them the shadows gathered with an eagerness all their own. Darkness in Oxford is never complete. There is always a candle somewhere, guttering unseen. But that night it pressed heavier than most. Lewis walked beside me in silence. His usual grumblings had grown rare of late. Perhaps the case had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He asked, almost reluctantly, whether I believed Caroline's death had been murder. I said the word too easily concealed uncertainty. Murder is always a definition, like a crossword clue, and some clues resist their answer. He muttered that answers were our job. I told him jobs are for porters. Truth is less obliging. We returned to the lodge. The porter had drawn the blinds, though light leaked through in strips. He admitted us with the tiredness of a man who keeps watch not for danger, but for explanation. He mentioned that one of the fellows had been seen leaving the library long after the concert. Which fellow he did not say. His glance flicked away too quickly. Lewis pressed, but the porter only muttered that he did not like to be involved. Involvement in Oxford is always involuntary, yet always denied. We crossed the quad again. The library door stood ajar, a slit of yellow against the stone. Inside, the air smelled faintly of candle smoke. The electric lamps had failed. Only a few candles burned on the long table, their flames restless in the draught. Somewhere in the stacks, a book fell with a dull thud, the sound of a body choosing not to rise. I moved toward the noise, Lewis behind me. At the far end, between theology and law, we found nothing but the book itself, its pages crumpled as if thrown down. Yet I noticed the shelf above bore a gap, the dust disturbed. Someone had removed a volume recently, perhaps moments ago. "The ledger?" Lewis asked. I told him ledgers rarely sleep in theology, though sins often do. We searched further, but the library yielded nothing more than silence. Then the candles sputtered, one by one, as though rehearsing extinction. For a moment we stood in near darkness, shapes barely defined. In that half-light I thought of Caroline again, her crossword unfinished, her music fragmentary, her notes blurred with ink. She had lived always in the half-light, reaching toward resolution but denied it. Lewis suggested leaving, but I lingered. My eye caught something on the floor beneath the desk nearest the north window. Her accustomed place, the librarian had said. A scrap of paper, torn unevenly, almost invisible against the boards. I bent and retrieved it. Only one word remained, scrawled hastily. Copy. The ink had run, as though dampened by sweat. Copy, the same word from her notebook, the same condition written in present tense. She had copied for someone, minutes, ledgers, confessions, and perhaps refused at last. Refusal is dangerous currency. The library darkened fully then, the last candle surrendering. We stood in a silence that seemed older than the college itself. Lewis shifted uneasily. He asked whether we should call for more light. I told him light was rarely summoned in Oxford. It comes, or it doesn't. We left at last, the heavy door closing behind us with a sigh. Outside, the rain had ended, but the clouds held the sky captive. The quad lay drenched, reflecting the lamps as if the stones themselves had wept. Lewis asked whether I thought we were close. I told him closeness is a relative thing. Sometimes the answer lies a step away, sometimes a life. That night, alone in my rooms, I placed the scrap beside the crossword. 2 clues, 2 fragments, both insisting on repetition. Copy. Ledger. Remember. words left behind like pebbles on a path that led only into shadow. I poured a whiskey and did not drink it, listening instead to the city's silence as it folded itself around me. Darkness had fallen, yes. But in Oxford, darkness is never final. It only waits, patient, for the next lamp to be lit, 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 next lamp to be lit.